This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June 14th, our Military History Night Speakers Series closed out our spring 2017 season with veteran D-Day and Arnhem paratrooper Charles Scot-Brown telling tales and sharing wisdom from his World War II days as a Canlone officer in a British Highland regiment.
Thank you. I just want to make one thing clear. Can you people in the back hear me? Because I hate microphones. All systems go, John?
Little faint,
God bless.
sir. Little faint for some of the guys back here.
I want to clear up a couple of points which I think most soldiers, sailors, and airmen would like to see our press people sort out. And that, what do you call people in the Canadian Forces? Well, it's quite simple and it's quite easy, but it seems to be in the press that everybody that's in the Department of National Defense is a soldier. That's a lie. They're not soldiers. There are sailors, there are soldiers, and there are airmen. And believe me, neither one of them want to be the other two. They stick to their own, and that's what makes the Canadian Forces as good as they are. And we didn't need Hellier to tell us that we had to have unification. We had that long before that. As a Patricia post-war, the Princess had married Admiral Ramsay. His nickname was Bertie. And any time you went into London, either during the war or post-war, you always went out to Patricia's home and the Admiral's home, and you went in and had tea. And the Patricia would very gratefully, the Princess, would offer you a drink. And you were told by the Admiral's equerry, always say yes, because the Princess holds the keys to the cabinet, and the Admiral likes his shot. So, with the result, the Patricias have no trouble getting along with the Navy. Along with that, when Hellier came in as the Minister of National Defense, he came out, he was Canada's first Trump. And he came up with the beautiful idea that no more foreign dignities could be honorary colonels and or in Canadian Forces. Our dear Patricia was getting very elderly, and while she was alive, no one else but her was our Colonel-in-Chief. And when she finally passed away, we were all very sad because she was a beautiful, beautiful lady. And she saved us. And she sort of gave the first to Hellier. She willed her regiment to her niece, Patricia Brabourne, who was married to Lord Brabourne. And her father was Louis Mountbatten. So needless to say, the Patricias had no trouble with the Navy. And of course, we would always turn the needle a little way. They would say, the trooping's coming up. And they'd say, yes. They'd say, who's going to be Lady Brabourne's equerry? We'd say, the Chief of the Naval Staff. Because she insisted, having been a Wren herself during the war, that she knew the naval routine very well, but her father knew almost everything about everything, and he was a super guy. And he came as a equerry and visited us 3 times. So we made sure that all the reserve officers in the 3 western provinces were invited to our trooping of the colors so they could meet Lord Louis. The Air Force, well, that's another story. Their takeoffs were so horrible, we wouldn't stick around for their landing. We'd just jump out the door.
You missed the best part.
But I tell you, some of it was scary too. Actually, the pub was the biggest thing in England. And as can loan officers, we got to know it very well, the pubs, because we were taken in by the officers of the British units which we served. But having been in the Canadian Army before I was and overseas as another other rank, because I was so young I couldn't, RMC was closed. They heard I was coming, so they closed it. And with the result that I knew a fair bit about pubs. And what you do when you go into a pub is you go in quietly and you stand, you have an agreement between the 2 or 3 of you that are together. We say, don't do any talking on any lawn subject or anything like that. Just stand at the bar, put your money on the bar, and don't say anything. So you go in the bar, and usually at the other end there was 3 Americans, and they were holding a Trump reunion. But at the other end are these 3 Canadians standing there, and the Brit bartender, or governor as they were quite often called, hated to see money on his bar unless it was being passed over to him. You didn't tip in the pub, you bought the pub maid or the pub guy a drink. And they poured the drink and drank it. Didn't put the money in their pocket. That shook us. The other thing which would drive them crazy was we would leave our change on the bar. The Brits always put the money in the pocket. So you would stand there and not say anything. And the Brits are exactly like the Taffies, the Jocks, and the Paddies. Good nicknames, all very proud. And while we were standing there, they have a degree of inquisitiveness. And they'd walk up to us and they'd say, "What's the matter, Canada?" We'd say, "Nothing. You're being so quiet. We're just thinking." "Well, what are you thinking about?" "Well, we're just sort of standing here thinking and having a quiet beer." "Oh, well, come on, join the group." And the next thing you know, we had infiltrated the Tower of London, and the Americans are spending 6 times the amount of money, making a lot of noise and everything like that, and we got invited back to the house for tea. Cunningness and stealth. Canadians were good at it. Can Loan was created in 1943. And the Brits had been fighting the war since 1939. We had a great expression in World War II when our American cousins came over. We said, "Nice to see you over. The bugle blew in 39 and you heard it in 41. But you were well trained because your fathers heard it and blew it in 14 and you guys heard it in 16, so you're just following the generation." And strangely enough, they never came back at us. But Canada in 1943 knew that the Quebec Conference was the actual setting for landing in Europe. And they said, "We got a plan for this." And they decided what size of a force they had. They were coming to that ideas, where, when, and how. A war has not really changed since the days of the Roman Empire. There's only one group that can take and hold land. Take and hold land. And that's the infanteers. The tanks can't do it. The Navy can't do it. They can go with guns. They can land with guns. They can fire. They can create casualties. They can't hold the land. The Air Force exactly the same. They can bomb, they can do all kinds of things, but really what they're doing is they are all working to get one guy with one cheap rifle on that piece of ground to take it and hold it. And the motto of the Infantry Corps is, it's hard to be humble. Along with it, and being very serious about it, that's why they call us the Queen of Battle. Within the Army, it takes roughly 46 men to put one infantry in the front line. All the rest are supporting them. The Navy have the job of looking after the wet MSR. The MSR is the main supply route, and the wet one the Navy look after. And they make sure the boats don't come in and stop them, and stop the ships coming in to resupply us. So how do you do this? How does this huge menagerie of people keep a battle rolling? And it's done with supply. Europe, for centuries, has always resupplied their people, their armies, by the most economical way they can. At one time, it was roads. And the roads were basically controlled by their chariots. And a chariot was pulled by two horses. And that chariot was metal and it was heavy. And it created a dip in the road. And that dip on the road, they said, why do we need these horses? Why don't we do it? So they said, right, we'll build carriages and we can get the horses to pull the carriage. Well, how wide will it be? Well, these Romans have already put the lines on the deal, on the roads, so we'll just put the tracks in there and run it. From that day, everything with a track axle has been standard. And the standard dip was two horses on the chariot, and the chariot being pulled by the two horses causing the dip, which means that we've been controlled and channeled by two horses' asses all our lives. That's a pub story. That is pub tactics. So we're back to the pub. All of a sudden now, you're set to go, and the first joke comes. And you laugh loud at the first one. You scorn at the second, and then you walk out in the third. And then when you come back the next day, they look at you and say, why did you leave so early? And we'd say, the jokes weren't funny. And they'd look at us, and then of course we'd break out laughing. And they'd say, you crazy suckers, you sucked us in again. And the next thing you knew, you were with the people. What is an army? A hell of a lot of men. Canada's start producing a military. The first overseas combat tour they had was South Africa. And we sent 3 battalions at various times, along with Canadian Mounted Rifles and cavalry. Roughly what we call now a battalion group. 800 to 900 men in the group. You have some artillery attached, etc. The first major win in South Africa given to the British was the Dawn of Majuba, won by the 2nd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment. You notice I said 2nd Battalion. That battalion was 90% soldiers from reserve units in the big cities and the big towns. The 48th Highlanders, the Queen's Own, you name them. The RCR, in their wisdom, had to stay back in Canada first and train these guys to make sure that they could look after their hat badge. It's hard to be humble. The next war we went was World War I. The Patricias were bought for $100,000, 1914 money. They could recruit any Canadian, but as long as he was not serving in any of the militia units or any of the Canadian Force units. Fortunately, after the Boer War, an awful lot of Canadian, or at least British people, came to Canada, especially the veterans. And these were the first guys that joined the PPCLI and what we call the originals. My mother's older brother joined that group, and A. Hamilton Galt, who in his spare time owned Sun Life Insurance. Hence the $100,000. They drew the people from the Boer War veterans, the originals. They spent a week in Valcartier and were immediately put on a boat and sent over to England to be attached to the British Army on the 82nd Division on the 27th Brigade. They were in France and had their first battle in 1914. Correction, 1914, correct. Friesenberg. They went in with 700 rifles and came out with 2 officers and 68 men. That was the first gas. That was the first major one for the Brits. The French soldiers from Morocco on their right side left, and the people on their right, which was the Rifle Brigade, stayed, and further along the other French unit took off, and the 2 English units, the Rifle Brigade and the PPCLI, held the line. 2 days later, 2 officers and 88 men from the PPCLI. All of a sudden, they had to reinforce the PPCLI in the British Army. How do you do it? The Canadians now were just themselves, 1st Division and 2nd Division, were starting to get casualties, and they were already dipping in to the reinforcement stream. So they said, well, we'll start a new group. They went out to the various universities, and they recruited from the universities. And the university companies, which came to reinforce the PPCLI, were the first ones to be shattered in that slaughter of 14 and early 15. The Patricias probably killed a large percentage of our clever young men. So in its wisdom, the Canadian Army decided to pull the Patricias out of the British Army, and they were just forming a new division now called the 3rd Division. The RCR had just finished hoeing potatoes in Jamaica, so they were available to join the 3rd Division. And that was the beginning of the PPCLI, and that is why to this day in our mess kits we still wear the French gray facings of the original 3rd Division. At the end of the war, Canada in 17, gave the British Empire and the Allies in France their first major victory. They took and captured and held Vimy Ridge at a great cost. And the work was fantastic. About 3 months ago, we had Barris here, and he told you all about it. How they drained the battlefield, how they dug the underground tunnels so they could resupply their soldiers and bring them up without them getting casualties on the way in. It was all done by good old-fashioned Canadian initiative. But how do we get this initiative? We get it from a very, very simple way. The people that came into this country. And it was the biggest hodgepodge you ever saw in all your life. But they also had pride, the pride of the country which they came from. You could find any language, you could find an answer to any problem you had within an infantry battalion of roughly 900 rifles. You could find that answer in those groups. And they came forward with it. And it was called Canadian Initiative, and we never, ever took that initiative away from the training of our soldiers. Now, I can speak this way because I have never fought Canadian soldiers. I have only fought British soldiers. So I'm not a Canadian veteran blowing my horn. I'm a Canadian that was critical of those guys in some cases. So when I say it, it's fact, guys, and I'm not snowing you. The Canadian soldier makes one damn fine good soldier. And that is why in the infantry corps, when anyone asks you, how did such and such, you go, the men did great. The patricians have a song, has anyone seen the colonel? He's dining with the brigadier. Has anyone seen the major? He's down in the deep dugout. Has anyone seen the captain? He's away on a 6 months leave. Has anyone seen the subaltern? He's out on a night patrol. Has anyone seen the sergeant major? He's drinking up the private's rum. This horrifies the Navy. We don't have officers touch rum. The RSM runs it. Keeps it neat and tidy, believe me, guys. And every time I went into a ship, I'd always say, I'll take the rum. And I'd look at the chief and I'd say, Chief, how are things going? Great. I said, good. I'll see you back in half an hour. I got to go to the loo. And I'd disappear and he'd say, geez, I like it when you take supper, sir. He said, it's easy. The sergeant major was drinking up the private's rum. The sergeant, you know what, I'm having a mental block. What did the sergeant do? He was everything in his own way. The corporal was hanging on the old barbed wire, and then the last one comes up. Has anyone seen the private? I know where he is. I know where he is. Has anyone seen the private? I know where he is. Has anyone seen the private? He's holding up the whole damn front, and he was. He was. Every captain in a ship, every captain in an airplane, every platoon commander in the infantry, or the troop commander in the cavalry, or the guns, the fighting arms will tell you that the men do the work. And they got great pride in their men because we trust them and we never take away that Canadian initiative. With the result, if the corporal gets dead, gets killed, there's some guy that's going to jump in and take over. And I'm looking at quite a few of the veterans that I know of in this group, and they're shaking their head up and down. So these are the tales of the pub. Then we hit Canlone. which was interesting as hell in World War II. There were 623 Canlone officers. There was 800 plus volunteered. That number was cut back to about 600. Medical, overage, trying to sneak in, trying to get overseas, etc. Hiding a jealous wife or something like that, I don't know. Anyway, they disappeared. We produced 623. We had a different uniform than the British. We had a different accent than them. We had different boots. And all of a sudden, we had about 1/3 very young, of which I was one of the babies. I was 20 years old. All set to get ready for Normandy, and that's why the Brits asked Canada. We just dropped 3 divisions, 2 in the east coast, 1 in the west coast. The soldiers were called out. They were drafted. The officers were active service officers. They had already volunteered to go overseas. And so we had a surplus, which doesn't happen very often in any army. We had this surplus of Canadian officers, and the British said, we are down to practically no reinforcements, and we don't know how we're going to meet our commitment for the assault landing in Normandy. So the Canlone went. And I can remember I went to the 2nd Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, because I was gazetted in 43 to the 48th Highlanders, so I went to their affiliated regiment. And the Gordons were called the Gay Gordons. They were the party guys. The Gordons could create a party in the middle of flipping nowhere with nothing. They were the funniest and the greatest guys you could ever meet. And you could see why the Queen and Queen Victoria and all of them love the north of Scotland in Aberdeenshire. When I joined the Gordons, I noticed that they were sort of looking at me. When you go into a Scotsman with a funny accent and a funny little mustache, it's supposed to make you look old instead of looking 20. It's supposed to make you look 23. But they never said anything. So the first challenge we had, we got new boots. What you normally do when you're invading a country and you're sending in your massed soldiers, you take away their worst uniform, give them a new one, complete with boots and everything. And that means that the ordnance and the main supply route is not having to resupply all those vehicles up because you sent them in old clothes. You couldn't afford all new ones, so you keep the best one and that's it. So we had these new boots to break in. And I was born in a place called Temiskaming, Quebec, which is pulp and paper town. And the water and the wood came in down Lake Temiskaming to the Ottawa River, and then down to the merchants in Ottawa, and they were called the lumber merchants, and they were the big-time operators in those days. They were the bond salesmen of today, in those days. And they knew mostly Norwegian and Scandinavian, strangely enough. My godfather was Danish, but he worked in the pay office. His name was Louis Rasmussen, and that's like saying an Irishman's name is O'Herney. And I looked at my sergeant and I said, Sergeant Hutchison, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I said, we got to break in these shoes. And we were in what they call billets. And billets is where the army comes into a town and they knock on your front door and say, how many bedrooms have you got in this house? And you say 3. And they say, how many people are living in the place? And they say, well, if you adjust this and that, you'll have 1 bedroom empty, won't you? And they say, yeah. They said, fine, we'll put 3 soldiers in it. They pay you a nominal fee. 1 in 6, whether it's there or not. Notice how clever I'm back with that pounds, shillings, and pence? That is a side story. Try and teach a bunch of Canadians how to handle British money. Very difficultly. Like two porcupines making love, very cautiously. Believe me. This was exactly the same. 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound, 21 shillings to a guinea. What's a guinea? What's the coin look like? Oh, there isn't a coin. You're telling this to a bunch of Canadians. A big Polish kid like Andy from Winnipeg, and you're trying to teach him that, and he's saying, what? No money? No coin? And they're looking at it. So I said, trust me. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take all the jocks. The soldiers are called jocks in the 51st Highland Division, 15th Scottish Division, and 52nd Lowland Division, which are the three divisions that Scotland produced in World War II. And I said, I want them to wear 2 pairs of socks, 1 pair of socks normal on the outside, but the inside sock, I want them inside out so that the ribs will be out, and you put the new ones in with the ribs and there will be friction. And my sergeant's starting to look at me right now, out this. And I said, is there any water around the place? We're built in Slough. Slough was a great place. 51st Highland Division just came back from landing in Sicily, cleaning the island, and then they were coming back to land on D-Day in 51st Highland Division. Great bunch of happy campers. But they were home for at least 6 months, and they were in Slough. And Slough is the candy factory of England. And you know what there is in candy factories? Hundreds of girls working. And you turn a bunch of oatmeal savages into a situation like that, and you got troubles, believe me. I thought I'd heard all the ones that Canadians could pull. Those oatmeal savages could beat them 6-1. So they're all saying, what gives us this crazy Canadian? What? 2 pairs of socks? We're going to have to wash 2 pairs of socks. And I never heard any of this, but Hutchison told me later. And he said, do what he says. Bang. And they all came out and they put their new shoes on. And Hutchison found a small little stream, sure enough in Slough, by one of the parks. I said, stand in the water until you can feel the water right up to the top of your boots. And they all did. And each corporal checked his own section out, and they were all wet. And I said, okay, now we're going to go for a small casual walk. They were just carrying their rifle and 2 bandoliers of ammunition. In those days, we were getting ready for D-Day. You carried your weapons with you in the infantry, no matter where you went, in case you were called at any time. With 50 rounds of small arms fire, 30 rounds for a pistol. So anyway, we did the walk, and I'd arranged the day before. There was a pub on the way back, and I said, are you going to be open about 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon? He said, no, you're not. He said, I don't open till 4, you know that. And I said, yeah, I know, but I said, could you pour a couple? He said, how many? I said, about 60. He said, 60? I said, yeah, I got a platoon, I said, and I want to give them a couple of beers. I said, I'll pay for it. He said, God, that's lovely of you. He said, I'll see if I can get the wife to help me and we'll get them out for it. So I had that organized as the ace in the hole. So we took them out for this walk, and we walked them back, and when you walk that, the boots are wet, the socks are wet. You walk the boot dry. The leather dries and it shrinks over the 2 pairs of socks. So that means when you take that out, that leather is already molded to the guy's feet. And it works. And you put the boots on and you'll never get blisters. I was the only one in 1st Gordon's that not one of my men had a blister. And of course my jocks are saying, look at that crazy savage you got, they said, as a platoon commander. We got the Canadian, he knows all about this stuff. Point one. Point one. The next one is the hardest one. We had a day for making amends. Making amends, the Navy used that expression also. It means where you take your kit and you check it, and if any buttons are missing or anything like that, you sew them on. And the officers have to go around and check it, or the chief, if you have something more important to do, and you can always find something more important. You can dream of a board of inquiry, and that's being busy. Anyway, doing the make amends, making sure that every pair of socks, 4 pairs of socks that they had, were 2 were new, the other 2 were all darn, no holes, nothing. They had perfect kits. And you walk around and check all these things, and I was going through, and this one about 18-year-old kid has got this sock, and he takes the needle and runs it all through it, pulls it up, takes the other end, ties a knot, cuts it, and he says, it's darned. And I looked at him and I said, where in the hell did you learn to darn like that? And he said, what do you mean, sir? I said, haven't you ever darned a sock? He said, I got 3 sisters. I never darned a sock or washed a sock in my life. I said, come here, I'll show you. So I reached down and I grabbed my commando knife and I started to cut all this stuff out. And I said, here's how you do it. You take your fist, you put your sock over it, you start this, you start that. Wolf Cubs, Boy Scouts, boom, boom. And I said, that's the way you do it. And I had that horrible, rotten feeling that there was somebody behind me. And I took a look around, and the whole platoon is standing there looking at me. And a voice in the back says, Canada's no all bad. He knows how to darn socks, you know. They were my guys. They were now my platoon. And if I said, go up that hill, they'd say, how fast? That is how you have to do it. You got to gain their respect and gain their trust. And once you've got that, it is the finest thrill in the world to take men into action. And dangerous. So you've got to be up to date on your drills. And all 3 services in the Canadian Forces stress drills. The first thing you learn the first day you're in is a drill. You get up at a certain time. You go to the loo at a certain time. You do everything on a time. Boom, boom, boom. No nonsense. You even get smart enough to know that if your mother or your sister asks you something, you say, yes, dear. You learn quickly with the drills. And that carries you through the rest of your life when your wife smiles at you when she throws a challenge. Again, going back to that pub. Well, getting back to the pub, you never show your hand in a game of poker until you're ready to grab the pot. And that is the same with the pub. When you're doing your early maneuvering in your new area. Now all of a sudden, they know that 3 or 4 of you will come in, stand in the corner, and be quiet. Won't talk, but they're there and they're quiet. And they know that they're Canadians because they got the funny battle dress on, and the money is on the bar. And they know that they all stick together, and they come together, and they leave together, and they talk together, and they sing together. And then they start to invite you into the group, and then you are now part of that town or part of that area. That is campaigning. What are you campaigning with? You're containing a force in the army. Your first force you have, and your basic force, is an infantry regiment. And an infantry regiment can have as many battalions, which are roughly 1,000, give or take, as that area can find volunteers for. In England, some battalions had, the Black Watch had 16 battalions in World War I. 16 battalions of Black Watch. That's a hell of a lot of red hackle. The Canadians usually had 1, 2, or 3. They also had a home battalion, which was the reserve battalion, usually the old-timers, and they trained the new kids when they first came in, and then you would send from your serving battalion, when they had the men, you would send them down to teach them enough battle drill so that when they came in, they weren't all arms and legs, they could move in with it. 3 infantry battalions make a brigade. 3 brigades make a division. 2 or more divisions make a corps. 2 or more corps make an army. In World War II, Canada had a small army. The historians, and I can say this as a Can loan officer because I did not fight with these guys, I watched them. Canada came back with an absolute definite red over green that they had produced the finest small army in World War II on both sides. That's how good the Canadian Army was. And that's how good the Navy were supporting us to make sure that we got our supplies back from North America and got our reinforcements in there and got everything we needed. And the Air Force that bombed us, we forgave them for that because there was another small group of Air Force guys who were the absolute cream of the crop, and that was the Tactical Air Force, the Typhoons. And I'm going to run you through something which I did in this club about 15 years ago. And that was, there used to be a group of Air Force guys that were Tiffy pilots. The Typhoon was nothing but an overgrown Spitfire. It had a heavier motor, and when it started, the torque of that propeller was so strong that it would flip the airplane almost over. And when they took off and they had full throttle to get the necessary speed for the heavy weight and the 6 cannons that those things had on their wings, 3 on each wing, that's why they were heavier than the Spitfire. Once you got that bird airborne, it was a beauty to fly. But they had more guys killed taking off than they did have shot down because this airplane was so. But boy, they were our bread and butter. If we hit a Tiger tank, at our battalion headquarters, we had a group of firepower people. We had the artillery there, we had our own mortars there, and they're in your tactical headquarters, and those officers will bring fire on you anytime you want. And we also had another group, which were the Air Force, and that was called a tentacle, Air Force tentacle, and they brought in the Typhoons. So as a company commander, and I did it a number of times, if my soldiers report a Tiger tank at such and such a place, I would pick up my handset and I would say, 1-6 Alpha for tentacle, target, 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 over. And the Air Force guy at battalion headquarters would say, tentacle to 1-6 Alpha, over. I got the guy from the Air Force. I give him the target in clear. an 8-figure map coordinates. Why do I give it in clear? Because the enemy knows where that tiger is, and they get one that's been put into script. They can break your code. So you always give enemy positions in clear, always. The other thing you never do is, on a wireless set, you never say repeat, because if you do, the gunners are going to fire again. You say again. So now you know why old soldiers, old sailors, and old airmen always say, when they don't hear you, say again. Once I gave that to him, he says, 1-6 Alpha, wait out. In other words, he's going to get on his map, see where it is, and perk it. He'll come back and he'll say, Wilco, out. In other words, I've got it, I will command, I will do it, and that's all I hear. And I kid you not, he takes that, he's got it planned on his map, he puts it in, the Air Force use areas to bring it in, and then they give articles. And that's why it's a grid from them, so they can see it and come down. And the next thing you know, about 75 feet off the ground, 2 typhoons come in, and those rockets go off. And one of those two will always, almost always, only once in a while do they goof, but one of those will get that Tiger tank. As soon as we see it blow, we say 1-6 Alpha for tank for tentacle. Well done, out. And that's the end of it. And these Tiffy guys looked at me and they said, we always wondered how it happened. We're having our reunion next week. Will you come in and talk to us and show us how it was done? I said, I'll even teach you how to do it. And we sat down and had a couple of beers, I think it was 7, and told a couple of lies, of course, and then we had it done. The one thing I want you to remember, all of you in this room, to the infanteers, I say thank you. Your forefathers did a great job at making the Canadian Army what it was. To the Navy and the Air Force, we hope you're proud of us because you made it possible for us to do it. And that is being Canadian and being together, and that is the same as tipping your hat to a lady, saying thank you, or as my grandfather or as my granny used to say, who was the spitting image of the Queen Mum, please and thank you cost you nothing, and they're the best passport in the world. And I see about 2 or 3 people smiling and putting their hand up. You must have had the same grandmother. God bless you all, and I hope you enjoy yourself. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I only wish my soldiers could have heard that applause. It would have made them happy.
Questions now?
Say again?
You'll take a few questions?
Yes, I will. Any questions at all? Yes.
Over here, Charles. Wasn't the Queen Mom the Colonel of Chief of the regiment that you used to belong to?
Say again?
Wasn't the Queen Mom the Colonel in Chief of the regiment you used to belong to, the Toronto Scottish?
I don't know.
Yes, she was.
Hey?
Yes, she was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she was very proud of the Toronto Scottish. The Toronto Scottish, of course, are affiliated in a roundabout way to the Gordons because they're affiliated to the London Scottish, who are in turn affiliated to the Gordons.
And I believe you used to have the honor to wear the Hagen Braid.
Say again?
You used to have the honor to wear the Hagen Braid?
Yes, I wore that. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you how I wore it, actually. I was being posted, I was ADC to Chris Folks at the end of the war. The war was over and the Pacific had dropped, we dropped the bombs and everything like that. And I was Chris Folks' ADC. And he was a great character and a lot of fun. And he used to look at me and say, "For God's sake, will you light?" And I'd say, "What's the matter, General?" He said, "Stop running around and just sit down and take things easy." I said, "Okay, General." But I said, "You're not going to get anything done if I sit around and do nothing." He said, "What, are you insinuating that I don't do anything?" I said, "Very well." And we sort of teased each other. We'd have great talks in the back of the car and all that kind of stuff. And he finally looked at me and he said, "You know, it's about time you started to learn how to work with Canadian soldiers. I'm going to send you back on regimental duty and I'm going to send you to the RCR." And I looked at him and I said, "I won't go to the RCR." He said, "Why not?" I said, "They're not my style of a regiment." He said, "Where do you think you should go?" I said, "To the PPCLI." He said, "That's a Western regiment, and what right do you think you have with a ZB number to go out west?" And I said, "Well, my mother's older brother was Ned Plant. And my Uncle Ned had a hell of a good war record. He was a good officer." And he said, "That was your uncle?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I'll phone up Cammy Ware." Now in those days, this is 1946, in those days, when you picked up a phone in Toronto and phoned Calgary, that was class. Not today, like you're with your whiz kids. So he said, "Cammy," and they were classmates at RMC together. So they said hi, go, and had a 2-minute yak about both of their families, their wives knew each other and everything else. So he got all that, and he said, "By the way," he said, "my ADC is ready to go back on regimental duty, and he wants to go to your regiment. He's Ned Plant's nephew." "Okay, Cammy, that's fine." And that's what I heard. So he hangs up the phone. He says, "Well, that's that done." And I said, "What happens?" He said, "Get your steamer trunk out and all your kit. You're going to Calgary tonight at 8 o'clock. Have a good time. Goodbye." That's how I got posted at PPCLI.
Charles, one of the challenges that I think the modern Army faces is folding people into existing organizations. You know, the posting cycles are such and demands in operational tempo are such. Can you give us any advice on how we can take someone who's not part of the group and make them part of the group quickly?
I think the best thing you can do, familiarity breeds contempt. And content. And one of the things I think, and try it out after we leave here. When you leave here, walk up to someone that you've never seen before or know and introduce yourself to them. And I'd like you to do it on the way out. And I bet you that you'll be amazed at the next time you see each other, you'll say, "Hi, how are you doing?" And I think that's the only way you can do it. It's strictly a shot in the arm. That's the way I'd handle it anyway. And I think if you try that, it'll work. It's got the kiss factor, and it's simple. And people like to be recognized. Everyone likes recognition. But don't give them recognition unless it's valid.
Charles, could I ask you, I heard a comment this morning on U.S. public radio that over 500 journalists were embedded in the D-Day landings.
Yes.
And not one single leak occur. Can you comment on this circumstance in relation to today's operations?
A lot of those correspondents would live with us in an infantry battalion, and they would spend time with us. And we got to trust them, and we knew who we could trust, and they knew who they could trust. And they weren't giving them false information. I'll give you a perfect example of how false information can come about. In 1948, we were doing an airborne operation in northern Alberta. And Exercise Eagle, it was called. And we got our first winter type clothing. And I was with the jump company, and this was state-of-the-art stuff. And one of the things, amongst other things, by the way, I've told this story to Andy, so I mean, he knows all about it. And one of my platoon sergeants was a Polak, and he comes back and he said, "Boy, this new kit's great." And we said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I took it home and showed it to my mother." And she said, "Tony, you got 2 pairs of pajamas, flannel pajamas. What are you, an officer?" He said, "No, that's what we wear under our clothes in DD time to keep us warm." And the flannel pajamas were cheap, and they kept us warm. And they were great. That hit the papers. But along with that, on the tunics, they had a plastic button. And that button was not sewn on, it was on with very heavy cloth and part of it so it wouldn't tear off, with gloves when you're opening it. And when you get a bunch of paratroopers together and they're not too busy and they've got time to think things out, the petard is going to hit the fan. Believe me, they're going to do it. And all of a sudden, I was standing in the bar, and I was with the jump company at that time. And we were standing at the bar, and this American guy is standing there, and it was the first time we had better kit than the Americans did. And boy, we were the proud cock of the walk, because you don't beat those guys too often. And this guy looks and he says, "You know, your people are wonderful. They must have thought of everything." So I looked at him, I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was talking to one of your soldiers today." I had the mortar platoon at that time, and I figured, uh-oh. He said, "Yeah." He said, "You know those buttons you got on your jackets?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "He told me that if you cut those off and put them in boiling water, it makes soup." Well, I'm looking at this guy, and he said, "Haven't you heard that?" I said, "Yeah, I heard what you said, but I said, I tell you what, I know what you'll get." He said, "What's that?" I said, "You'll get a lump of plastic about that big. That's all." Never underestimate what soldiers will do. And there's a Strathcona here, and we're very close, the Patricias and the Strathcona. They're our tanks. And if he's in trouble, I get him out. If I'm in trouble, he gets me out. If I'm walking in from Wainwright, his tanks are available for my guys to jump on. We're very close, our 2 regiments. And in the old days, we used to drive when everything was up in Camp Borden. We used to drive the Armored Corps School and the Infantry Corps School crazy, because the RCR and the RCDs are sort of like that. Not the happiest bunch of campers for infantry come take. Strauss and the Patricias are like that. The Van Doos, well, they're always up in the guard with their red guard. So anyway, the whole deal of it is get things together, get the people together. And I'll tell you, and you can take the story back to the regiment when you go. This would have been about 1947, and Tojo Griffiths had the recce troop. And they were, they're the tanks that go out to draw fire, find out where they are, and then disappear. They can do an about turn in nothing flat and get out when somebody shoots at them. That's their aim. That's what they do. And Tojo in those days, the Armored Corps were short of men, and they didn't have their co-driver in the tank. And Tojo was on the dirt list with the commanding officers where he said, I'll give you 4 days to get those tanks retreaded. And he said, get them all checked out and then we'll be all set to go to Wainwright. And he came up to our mess. We used to go back and forth, the junior officers, and have a beer together and tell lies and have some fun. And Tojo came in and he said, I'm in big trouble. I said, what's the matter, Tojo? He said, there's no way I can do that in 4 days. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's straight bull hard work. Those treads are steel and they are flippin' heavy. And he said, 3 guys in a tank can't retread it in that period of time. They just physically can't do it. I said, I tell you what, I got the mortar platoon. And I've got 52 guys in my mortar platoon. And most of them are Ukrainian or Polish. And I said, those suckers love to work. And they do. They're greatest guys you could ever have. And I said, I think my guys would like to do something different. What say we practice them on changing treads on your tank? So we did. And we did it in 2 days. Tojo and I go down to the Strathcona mess, and we're standing there having a beer, and the commanding officer came over, and he said, Tojo, what are you doing in the mess here drinking beer when your men are working? He said, the job's done, sir. He said, can't be. There's no physical way you could have that done. He said, it's done. Then he looked at me. And then he looked at Tojo. And he said, what are you two suckers up to? And I said, well, from what I gather, I said, you had an ugly on and you're taking it out in my buddy Tojo. And he looked at me, he laughed, and he said, one thing about it, Charles, a spade's a spade. And I said, that's the way you like us, sir. That's the way my commanding officer likes his officers, and so do you, so that's why I answered you that way. He said, it's done. I said, infantry come tank. That means the two of us are working together. We work very close together with the armored. I said, if Tojo's in trouble, I get him out of it. If he can get me out of trouble, we do it. And I said, not only that, I owe him 3 IOUs because he brought my mortar platoon back in because I was going to run them and the suckers got on the tank and beat me out of it. And he laughed and he said, okay. And he shook his head and he said, okay, you 2 apples, what do you have to drink? And we looked at him and said, well done, sir. And the 2 of us walked away. That's the camaraderie that you have. That's what you get when you're close together. And that's how Canadians win battles. If we need each other's help, it's there. And I don't care what else it is, it can do it in business too.
Brian.
Charles, I remember you telling me when you came back after the war that you were still with your parachute regiment, were still doing display jumps around Canada actually to show people. And one time you were on your way from Winnipeg, jumped at the RMC and you had to refuel at Thunder Bay. And you had an incident with one of the soldiers who was on board the aircraft at the time you were about to refuel. Do you remember, if you wouldn't mind, because I thought that was a really touching story you told about that.
I'd rather rest on that, Brian, if you don't mind. It was a touching deal.
Any more questions?
He survived all right, fortunately, as you know.
It was to do with one soldier, I think he was a sergeant, actually as he was landing, he had an issue with his, he said,
Oh yeah, oh that was O'Brien. Yeah. That was, I'm sorry, I got it mixed with another one. We were flying from Calgary to, the RCR were busy. They couldn't parachute. And so they asked us, the Patricias, if we'd put on a couple of demonstration parachute drops for the staff college in Kingston. It was before it moved up to Kindergarten of the Air up there on Yonge Street, Old Yonge Street. And so anyway, we had to refuel. We were using Dakotas then. This would have been about 60, or at least, correction, 40, I think it was 49. It was just before Korea, anyway. Probably 49. So we refueled at the Lakeheads, Port Arthur, Fort William, still in those days. And I went back, and Corporal O'Brien, MM, who had been with 6th Airborne Division, and got his MM right after the war when the 6th Airborne Division went to Palestine and were doing the buffer between the Palestinians and the Jews. And O'Brien got the MM for it, and a very good one. And he's sitting there shaking, and it was not like O'Brien. So I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I understand we're landing in," with his Irish accent, he said, "I understand we're landing in Port Arthur, Fort William to pick up petrol." I said, "Yeah, O'Brien, why?" He said, "Oh," he said, "I'm not too happy about that." I said, "What's the matter?" Because we had our chutes right with us. We use them as pillows if you're doing a long flight, because it's just perfect for your head. And I said, "Well, it's okay. There's nothing to worry about." I said, "How many jumps have you had, O'Brien?" And I think he said in the average of 20, 25 or that. And he had two operational jumps. And he said, "I'm worried." And I said, "What for, O'Brien? Come on, spit it out." He said, "I never landed in an airplane in my life." The sucker had nose run out the door. So anytime the Air Force gives us a hard time about how can you how can you jump out of a perfectly serviceable aircraft, we immediately look at them and say, "Your takeoffs are so rotten, we won't stick around for your landings." Thank you ever so much, and have a great day.
This has been another in the series of podcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find notices of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening.